Today we're going to talk about Chapter 1, which is an introduction to anatomy and physiology, and we're also going to look at body orientation, which is also a part of Chapter 1. So what is anatomy? Anatomy is the science of body structures and the relationships among them. So when we're looking at anatomy, we're looking at different organs, organ systems, the body, bones, muscles, being able to label everything and being able to identify everything. Physiology is the science of body functions. So how does the body work? Like when you eat something, how do you taste something? Or as you breathe in and out, the oxygen that we breathe in, how does that work in our body? What does our body do with it? Or how does a muscle work to pick something up off a table? We're going to look at some of those between Anatomy 1 and some other parts you will look at when you take Anatomy 2. There's several different kinds of anatomy. Here's just a sample of some of them. We have developmental anatomy, which looks at the growth and development from the fertilization of the egg to death. We have embryology, which is the first 8 weeks of growth and development. That's in utero. It happens the first 8 weeks right after fertilization is embryology. We will be looking at a lot of embryology and developmental biology during this class. We're also going to spend some time with cell biology. So what's the cellular structure? How do cells function? We're going to look at that. We're going to look at all the different parts of the inside of a cell. We're also going to look at gross anatomy. It's what you see when you look at a person. It's the structures you see without a microscope. We have systemic anatomy, which is how this class is laid out. We look at many different body systems as we go. We have regional anatomy, which is looking at just specific regions of the body, like the head, the chest, the arm, the leg, and histology. We're going to do a lot of histology in this class between Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2, which are microscopic structures of tissues. So we're going to look at many different tissues under the microscope. We're going to need to be able to identify many different tissue structures as well. There's also many different kinds of physiology. Remember, physiology is how something works. So we have molecular physiology, which we will look at, which is the function of individual molecules, like how is sodium, calcium, potassium, how is that used in our body? We have neurophysiology, which is how nerve cells work, how our brain works, and how nerves work too when you touch something. And what does it take to stimulate that nerve to send information to your brain? Endocrinology, which is the function of hormones that function on the body. There's so many different hormones in the body. We'll learn some of them in Anatomy 1, like thyroid hormone. What does that do to your body? There's calcitonin. What does that do? There's also oxytocin, cortisol. There's lots of different hormones. There's lots of different endocrine organs. That's studied more in Anatomy 2, but we will look at some endocrinology depending on what organ system we're working with. There's immunology. Immunology is the body's defense system. So your immune system. How does your immune system work? There's white blood cells in your immune system. We'll look at them in this class, and you'll learn how they function more in anatomy too. We have exercise physiology, which is the changes in cells and organ functions due to activity. So even if you don't, quote unquote, exercise, just moving from one place to the next, that's still technically doing some sort of activity. So how the body and the organs function is you do those walking up the stairs, walking from your car in the parking lot into a building. That's still technically a form of exercise. We have pathophysiology, which is functional changes with disease and aging. So what happens to your body when you get cancer? You get a burn. That's still pathophysiology. Because that affects the skin. What happens if you have diabetes? What does that do to the body? That's all affected in pathophysiology. We also have cardiovascular physiology. We want to know how does the heart work? And blood vessels. Blood vessels will dilate or get bigger or constrict, just get smaller due to different causes. Could be exercise, could be hormones. There's a lot of different things that could cause that. And that'll mostly be covered in anatomy too. But this, I wanted to kind of show you there's lots of different kinds of physiology. What we're going to start in this class with is we're going to follow this system. We're going to start at the chemical level. We're going to look at each individual atom, what makes up those atoms. So we're going to spend some time on chemistry at the beginning. Get a little introduction to chemistry here. Then, how do those atoms build molecules? We're going to look at how that happens. Now those molecules form different organelles in the cellular level. We're going to look at that. So we have a smooth muscle cell here. Have one individual cell that goes and creates a whole layer of tissue for smooth muscle tissue. There's lots of different kinds of tissue. We're going to spend some time working on the many different kinds of tissue. Smooth muscle is one of those types of tissues you can find in blood vessels. And this is at the organ level because your blood vessels are part of the cardiovascular system, which makes up that specific organ. We also have an organ system. Here is a view of the cardiovascular system. It includes your heart. It includes all your arteries and veins in the body. Then we're also going to look at how that all translates into who you are as a human being. We're going to look at how individual atoms become molecules, that become cells, that becomes tissues, the organ level, that becomes an organ system that makes up each one of us. It's different for every single person. So as we just talked about with that picture, we have the chemical level, which is the atoms and molecules. Two or more atoms together will make up a molecule. We have the cellular level, which is the molecules that form cells. We have muscle cells, nerve cells, your skin. Your skin is all cells. We have the tissue level, or the groups of cells and their surrounding material that form the tissues. Like your muscles, all your muscles are lots of cells put together to make, say, your biceps that lets you bend and straighten your arm. We have this organ level, which is what the tissues come together to make an organ, like cardiac tissue. Cardiac cells make cardiac tissue. Cardiac tissue makes your heart. You wouldn't be alive without one. We have our system level, which we looked at on the previous slide of the entire cardiovascular system, which is the heart, arteries, and the veins in your body. Then we have the organismal level, which is the human being, the human body. How does it function? How do all the organs function together to let you make it through each individual day? So here's a list of the many different systems in the body. Between Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2, we are going to cover every one of these systems in depth. Anatomy 1 will cover 1 through 4. Anatomy 2 will cover 5 through 11. Just so you have an idea. But let's get a quick overview of what these different systems are. So we have what's called our integumentary system. Our integumentary system is our skin, our hair, our nails. They all make up the integumentary system. Some of the cool things that our skin does is it synthesizes or makes vitamin D. All it takes is 20 minutes outside in the sun. I know, without sunscreen, but that'll give you 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. That's what we need for a day in our daily life. That only requires 20 minutes. I mean, we really should be wearing sunscreen inside, and we live outside. We also live in the northern hemisphere where we don't always get enough sun to get through each day. So majority of people in the northern hemisphere are actually vitamin D deficient just because we don't get enough sun every day. That's why a lot of people need to supplement vitamin D. Our integumentary system, or our skin, also houses pain and pressure receptors. Like when you feel pain in your, like just deep to your skin, those are nerve cells that are feeling those. We also have pressure receptors. So if somebody taps on you and to get your attention, that's a pressure receptor. That's a nerve cell that feels that pressure and sends something to the brain. We also have sweat glands and oil glands. If you haven't never washed your hair for a couple of days and your hair gets really oily, that's because in each individual hair shaft, there's oil glands in there. There's also oil glands on your skin. That's why some people, their face gets really oily. It's because they may have extra oil glands or just overactive oil glands on their skin somewhere. And then sweat glands, you all know when you get really hot and you start sweating, those are your sweat glands kicking in as your body's mechanism, which we will talk about later in this chapter, to help cool you off. The next organ system is our skeletal system, which consists of our bones. Our bones are what help support or protect our organs, like our rib cage around our chest. That helps support your heart and your lungs. It also supports your kidneys in the back. So your kidneys are back in here. So your skeletal system helps to protect those. And in your pelvis, you have your reproductive organs, your bladder, you have your part of your colon and your intestines are in your pelvis and your hips. Your bones also store minerals. They store calcium. A lot of calcium is stored in your bones. So if your calcium level gets low, your bones will start resorbing, or kind of there's cells that'll start eating away at the bones a little bit to get more calcium out into the bloodstream. That's another form of what we call homeostasis. We'll talk about in a little bit, that how your body kind of regulates the minerals in your body. We also have skeletal muscles. Your skeletal muscles are what let you move. They will let you pick up a cup of water to have a drink. They'll let you walk across the room. They let you hold your phone and play games. That's all done with your muscles. They help you maintain your posture. They let you smile, frown, look surprised. Your muscles also produce heat. Like when you exercise and you get really warm and start sweating a lot more, those are your muscles producing a lot of extra heat. We have our nervous system. Our nervous system runs 24/7. It reacts to all kinds of stimulus. It reacts to temperatures in the room, outside, wherever you're at. It responds to pain, pressure. It responds to movement. You could feel like if somebody's tapping on your shoulder to get your attention, go back to that example. There's a nerve wherever that person's tapping that goes up to the brain, and then the brain sends a signal back down to tell you to turn around and look at who's tapping on your shoulder. So your nervous system is always working. It even works when you sleep. When we get to the nervous system, we'll go over that. And we're also going to talk about how your brain learns. So you know what happens when you're learning something and how to store something that goes to short-term memory, something you learn, and how to store it in long-term memory to keep it there so you don't forget it as soon as you take a test on it. Because I know we're all good at cramming as much information in and dumping it out on a test. When we're studying something like anatomy, we don't want to do that. Especially if you're going into a medical field, you want to be able to remember what you learned. So we're going to spend some time on how your brain learns so you can help retain this information instead of constantly forgetting it and then having to relearn it again. The nervous system here, this is the end of what we will cover in Anatomy 1. Part of Anatomy 2, we look at the endocrine system. Your endocrine system is what produces all the hormones in your body. So there's 2 endocrine glands in your brain. There's the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. We also have the thyroid gland in your neck. We have our pancreas, which provides a lot of the hormones and the enzymes that are needed to digest your food. We have adrenal glands. If you think about, if you've ever heard the terms rest and digest or fight or flight, your adrenal glands produce the hormones that do most of that. So when you get really stressed out, high anxiety, those are hormones coming from your adrenal glands. We have in females, we have the ovaries. Those produce a lot of your estrogen. And the testes, in males, those produce a lot of the testosterone. We also have the thymus. It is most active when you're a child, and by the time you're an adult, it's kind of shriveled away. It's not very useful anymore, but it helps produce immune cells to help with the body, with your immune system, and fight any kinds of defense systems. Cardiovascular System. Again, that's your heart, arteries, and veins. How the heart transports oxygen around the body, how it collects carbon dioxide to get rid of, how they utilize the lungs to do that. The cardiovascular system also gets rid of wastes in the body. It's collected and those are cleaned out by the kidneys. Our lymphatic system and our immunity system. We have a lymphatic system that travels throughout the body. If you've ever heard of lymph nodes, those are part of that lymphatic system. There's lymph fluid that travels through the lymphatic system, and it houses a lot of your antibodies and white blood cells. So when you get a cold, there's white blood cells that go into that lymphatic system and try to find the antibody that you may have been exposed to in the past, the same virus. They try to find that antibody for that virus that may have invaded your system to kill it off quicker. If you've never been exposed to the virus that comes in your system, it takes 7 to 10 days for your body to develop those antibodies to kill off that virus. So that's, I think this, like the immunology section or the immune system is looked at more in microbiology than in anatomy, but this system does work with the white blood cells in your cardiovascular system to help keep you healthy. We have our respiratory system. Our respiratory system is our lungs, and in the trachea that helps bring the air to and from the lungs, the larynx, which is the back of your throat, the pharynx, which is more straight back from your throat, the nasal cavity where you breathe in and out the air. There's also little air sacs inside the lungs where oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged. And there's a whole process for how that works. We'll learn more about that when you take Anatomy 2. We have our digestive system. Your digestive system is what breaks down food, and it helps to absorb nutrients while the food travels through your small intestines and then into your large intestine. And whatever's left by the large intestine mostly sucks out water. Then whatever your body cannot digest is eliminated as feces. So your digestive system starts at your mouth and ends in the anus. So this is one organ system that has an entry and an exit hole. We also have the urinary system. Your urinary system, your kidneys help to filter and clean out blood and get rid of any wastes. So those kidneys are filtering the blood, pulling wastes out of the blood to eliminate through urine. It regulates water, so if there's too much water in the system, it'll help eliminate that. It keeps your electrolytes balanced in your body, so make sure that you have enough sodium, potassium, calcium, all of that. And it also keeps an acid-base balance, which you'll learn about more in Anatomy 2. Our male reproductive system. We'll learn how the male reproductive system works and how it aids in the delivery of sperm to females through the reproductive tract. We will also learn the female reproductive system and how the ovaries produce eggs. They also produce the female hormones for estrogen, and how We'll even learn step by step as we cover the different organ systems. We'll learn how those organ systems develop. We'll learn how they age over time as well. So let's look. What are the characteristics of a living human organism? You have to have all 6 of these to be considered a living human organism. You have to have a metabolism. It's the sum of all chemical processes that occur in the body. So how is food broken down? How is energy created? How is energy used? That's all part of the metabolism. Responsiveness. So the ability to detect change and respond to changes. So if somebody gets tapping on your shoulder, can you respond to that? Do you know that somebody's actually tapping on your shoulder? Can you feel that or not? You have to be able to move. The whole body has to move. Individual organs move, like your heart pumps. Your lungs breathe in and out. How cells move. And how they all coordinate together to let you move. Growth. If you think of a newborn baby and how tiny they can be, not only does their body increase in size, but as their body increases in size, the number of cells increase as well. There's more cells. Cells get bigger to create the organs. How all of that comes together. And there has to be a differentiation. So the development of a cell from an unspecified to a specified state. So when cells are first created, they usually come from stem cells. And then stem cells create new cells that become different cells throughout the body. Like in your skin, there's a layer of stem cells. And those stem cells create more skin cells. In your bones, there's a layer of stem cells. And those stem cells turn into many different kinds of cells in the bones, which we will learn about. Some that kind of eat away at the bone, some that build new bone, some that just monitor the bone status. Then there has to be some kind of reproduction. Not only the female and male reproductive systems, but cells. Cells have to be able to reproduce to create new cells. So everything has to be able to reproduce. Now let's look at homeostasis. Homeostasis is the process I talked about a little bit earlier. Homeostasis is being able to keep a stable condition in the body's internal environment. I kind of use that example of when you get really hot, you start to sweat. Or if you get really cold, you get goosebumps on your arms, legs, anywhere. That's your body's way to try to warm itself up. That's 2 examples right there of how your body maintains homeostasis. So some of the major important aspects of homeostasis is maintaining body fluids. We have interstitial fluid, which is found inside of cells. Then we have extracellular fluid. That's found outside the body cells. So that interstitial fluid, that extracellular fluid that fills the narrow spaces between tissue cells. So you may not really be able to notice it. When we look at connective tissue, probably next week, it's in chapter 5, I think, if I remember right. But there's fluid between each of the cells. And that's called interstitial fluid. Blood plasma. If you've ever had blood drawn from your arm, you'd see that blood is a liquid for the most part. But blood plasma is that extracellular fluid within blood vessels. Plasma is technically kind of a yellowish color, but because the blood cells are mixed in, that's what makes it look red. If you've ever been in a lab where blood has been drawn and it's been let to sit for several hours, the blood vessels tend to all drop to the bottom and the plasma stays towards the top. So then you start to see that yellow plasma separated from the red blood cells. There's lymph plasma, which is the fluid that flows through the lymphatic system. We have cerebrospinal fluid. That is fluid that surrounds your spinal cord and surrounds your brain. It's created in the brain, but that's what helps protect your brain. It helps to protect your spinal cord, but it can also get infected. So meningitis, that's actually an infection of what are called the meninges, which is the inner layer by your spinal cord where fluid kind of flows. There's synovial fluid. So in joints, like in your fingers, in your back, in your knees, there's fluid in those joints to help them move freely. There's also aqueous humor and vitreous body of the eyes. The vitreous body is in the posterior part of your eye, and that helps maintain the shape of the eyeball. The aqueous humor is in the front part of your eye. We'll learn more about that when we get to special senses. But those help to kind of maintain and keep the shape of your eye. So what happens if there's some kind of disruption with homeostasis? It can happen, it can be something external, like I've talked about temperature, or it could be something internal. Could get sick. Enough hormones may not be released from the body that could cause problems. That's how diabetes happens. It's not enough insulin is being secreted for type 1 diabetes. If that disruption is mild and temporary, the body works really well to respond. Like a mild is a temperature change going from 70 degrees inside to 100 degrees outside, you're going to start sweating pretty quickly. Or going from 70 degrees inside to 10 degrees outside. You're going to get cold really quick. And your body's going to react by giving you boost bumps to try to warm you up. But if that disruption is extreme, like when I was talking about insulin that is produced by the pancreas that helps with blood sugar levels. If there's not enough insulin being produced in type 1 diabetes, homeostasis may fail because the body doesn't know how to fix that very well. That's where type 1 diabetics have to give themselves insulin so they can break down any sugars in their blood. So we also have the nervous system and the endocrine system. Those are the two organ systems that regulate homeostasis. That nervous system and the endocrine system. The endocrine system sends out the hormones to help regulate your internal system. Your nervous system also monitors all your hormone levels. So your brain is always keeping track of all of that. But it also responds to external stimuli. Temperature, pain, pressure. It responds to all of that. So here's kind of a nice picture that shows how we try to maintain a balance in homeostasis. So if we have some kind of stimulus that can cause an imbalance in that homeostasis, so there's different receptors around the body, inside and outside, that respond to this homeostasis. We have some kind of input that are sent along afferent pathways. Afferent goes towards the brain, and efferent is the response that comes out of the brain. And your control center is your brain. So that control center is telling us what is happening, or determines what's happening and sends it back out to what to do. Our output is the information sent along the efferent pathway. So the brain telling the body how to respond to a change or disruption in homeostasis. And then our last step is the response. What does the body do to return to homeostasis? The body is constantly adjusting to all kinds of stimuli all day long. A lot of things you don't even realize. So here's the examples I used earlier. You get really hot working out. So temperature sensitive cells in the skin, in the brain, tell the body to start sweating to release extra heat. Or it's very cold outside. Not only does it produce goosebumps, it can cause you to shiver. Both of those are the body's way to help warm the body back up. So we have a feedback system with homeostasis. There's 3 components to that feedback system. We have receptors that are always monitoring any kind of change, and they send input to the brain. That's through afferent pathways. Afferent is always going to the brain. When kind of a receptor monitor notices something, it sends input directly to the brain, and the brain will send out what to do. So step 2 is the brain sets the values in which controlled conditions could be maintained, evaluates the input it receives from the receptors, and generates an output command. So you're cold. A receptor in the skin sends that message to the brain that you're cold. What the brain will do, it receives that information, and then it sends information from the brain through the efferent. Efferent goes out. It generates a command for what the body should do, and it sends it to the rest of the body. Those effectors receive output from the brain and respond to the change. So you're cold. It tells you to shiver, or it gives you goosebumps. Those are all part of the feedback system of homeostasis. Now, the body uses 2 different types of feedback. They have negative feedback and positive feedback. Sometimes telling the difference between the 2 can be a little bit confusing. So with negative feedback, the goal is to return or reverse the original stimulus. It can cause a decrease in function. So again, I've been talking about temperature for a while. Temperature regulation is a negative feedback. So the body temperature drops, shivering increases the body temperature, so you're trying to get back to its original status. Or the body temperature rises, sweating cools off the body. You're trying to get back to the original setting. So your normal body temperature is usually 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or approximately 37 degrees Celsius. Somewhere in that range. Your body tries to maintain that temperature. So your body temperature goes up, it's going to sweat to try to get back to that 98.6. It wants to get back to that original place where it was. Another example, your metabolism is a negative feedback. When you're hungry, but there's no food around. Your metabolism starts to slow down to conserve energy. So what your body is trying to do is not use as much energy when you're hungry, because your body doesn't know how long it's going to be until you get food. So once you get food, if you ever notice when you're hungry, how you get tired. But once you eat something, you have more energy again. You feel more wide awake. That's a negative feedback system that's producing that. Let's look at a positive feedback. Positive feedback tends to strengthen or reinforce a change in the body's controlled conditions. So the brain still provides commands to the effector, but provides a response that adds to or reinforces that initial change. The best example is natural or normal childbirth. So we have contractions that start to the push of labor that helps push that fetus into the cervix to come out. There's a stretch. As soon as the stretch of the cervix starts, the brain releases oxytocin. That's a hormone that comes from one of the two endocrine systems, endocrine glands in the brain, but it releases the oxytocin to produce stronger contractions in the uterus to help push that baby out. That's a positive feedback because it's reinforcing or it's strengthening. It's adding more to it to get that baby to come out. Another example is you lose a lot of blood. Your body maintains about 5 liters of blood average. That's just kind of the average between men and women. Men usually have a little bit more. Women sometimes have a little bit less, but it's usually right around 5 liters of blood. So if you lose like 2 liters of blood, because if you go donate blood, they usually take about a liter out. But if you lose like 2 liters of blood, your blood pressure drops dramatically. Your blood cells start receiving less oxygen, which means all the cells in your body start receiving less oxygen. So your whole cardiovascular system kind of depresses and slows down. So in that case, we're reinforcing the change. We don't have as much, your heart doesn't have as much blood to pump out. So in response to not having enough blood to pump out, your cardiovascular system slows down. So your heart fills up with more blood before it pumps out. You'll learn more about that when you get into anatomy too. But that's another really good example of a positive feedback. So let's look at this example again. Here's another example of positive feedback in the cardiovascular system. So you get a tear in the wall of a blood vessel. Good example is when you go get blood work done or go donate blood, they're sticking a needle into that blood. So that's causing a hole or a break in that blood vessel. Your blood contains a lot of platelets. So your platelets come to the area where the hole is in the blood vessel. It forms a plug in the blood vessel. So it plugs the hole up so blood can't keep escaping. Once that hole is plugged up, chemicals are released that attract even more platelets to come to the area to reinforce that plug still. Once the hole is completely plugged up, there's no blood seeping out anywhere, is when the end of the positive feedback cycle. So if you think about it, you get a hole in a blood vessel, platelets start to come, but then there's chemicals released that bring lots more platelets to the area to create a really good plug in that hole in the blood vessel to help prevent more blood loss. So if we want to maintain good health, we need to maintain homeostasis in our body. So to have good health, you need to be in a good environment and have good behaviors. Going out and binge drinking all the time, that's not necessarily a good behavior. You also have to, unfortunately, something you cannot control is good genetic makeup. That's the one thing that you cannot control in your health, unfortunately. So you try to work hard on being in a good environment where you're not around a bunch of chemicals all the time. Try to have good behaviors, exercising, not smoking, not drinking, not eating lots of fatty foods, which feeds into the third one, the air you breathe. You're breathing in clean air, eating healthy foods, even the thoughts you think. If you're constantly thinking negative thoughts, that affects your health. If you're thinking good, happy thoughts, that helps improve your health. So something to kind of think about, because trying to even just come up with one positive thing a day helps change your whole outlook on life after a while. So the way you live can either support or interfere with your body's ability to maintain homeostasis. So getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, breathing clean air, thinking happy, good thoughts, help maintain that homeostasis. Binge drinking all the time, smoking, eating fatty foods all the time, eating McDonald's every day, Wendy's, any of that every day, that inhibits your body from maintaining homeostasis. So if you think about it, a lot of diseases are a result of years of poor health and behavior. It's not just one thing, it's many years of the same kinds of behaviors can cause all kinds of different diseases because it interferes with the body's ability to maintain that homeostasis. And if we're constantly interfering with the body's ability to maintain homeostasis, your body's going to respond in ways later on in life that's not going to be good. So something else to kind of think about. So if we look at homeostatic imbalances, we have disorders. That's any abnormality of structure or function. So there's lots of disorders. There's lots of diseases. Because diabetes, I've mentioned a few times, is a disease. There's cancer is a disease. So a disease is a specific term for an illness characterized by a recognizable set of signs and symptoms. Like diabetes, there's lots of signs and symptoms. And then once you're diagnosed with diabetes, there's lots of diseases to watch out for that affect you. If you have diabetes because your body is having a hard time maintaining homeostasis, it takes longer to recover from things. There's local diseases that could affect one part of the body. There's also systemic diseases that affect either the whole body, the entire body from head to toe, or several parts of it. Like diabetes is a systemic disease. Hypothyroidism, the slow thyroid, because your thyroid hormone affects every cell in the body, that's another systemic disease. Symptoms are signs of those local or systemic diseases. They're subjective a lot of times. So they're things that you may experience, but a doctor may not physically see on you. Like when you have a headache, a doctor can't physically see that you have a headache. That's something that you feel. Nausea, the same way, same thing. You feel nausea, a doctor won't see that nausea. Anxiety, that's something else that you feel. There are some symptoms that doctors can see with anxiety. There's usually raised blood pressure, your pulse rate's usually higher. Sometimes your pupils change size with anxiety. So there are some physical signs of anxiety, but like headache and nausea are good examples of symptoms that you feel, but a doctor won't really be able to physically see. Signs, on the other hand, are what health professionals, doctors, and nurses can observe or measure. So you have swelling. You roll and sprain your ankle. Your ankles can get swelled up and get pretty big. So it's pretty easy to see that one's bigger than the other. A rash, that's very easy to see because it's some kind of discoloration in the skin somewhere. A fever. We all have thermometers. We can check our fever. That's a sign. High blood pressure. That's another really good sign. That's easy to tell. To be diagnosed with high blood pressure, it needs to be checked, be high on 3 separate occasions. It needs to be elevated. They don't diagnose high blood pressure on just one try. It's usually diagnosed off of 3 separate occasions. One of the things that a lot of people study with homeostatic imbalances is epidemiology. So why something happens, when does it happen, and where does it happen in the body? And how are they transmitted among individuals in a community? We've all lived through COVID. There's a lot of people that studied the epidemiology of COVID. Like, first of all, what was it? Or what is it? It's a kind of virus. When it was first discovered, they had to answer that question. What is it even? Why does it affect some people, but not one way, while other people may not have any symptoms at all? That's a question that still has a big why question mark. When? Like, if somebody gets infected with COVID, how many days does it take before they start showing some signs or symptoms? Where in the body does one person experience it versus somebody else? I mean, I had a friend who felt like she had a sinus infection and it was COVID. My sister felt like she had a really bad cold with a really hot, she had 104 fever with COVID. So where does it affect different people? Different people it's affected in different places. Then how is it transmitted among people? That's always looked at. Like the big one going around now is monkeypox. So they're looking at how that one's transmitted. Where are people affected by it? Is it more prominent? What areas is it more prominent in? Is it more prominent in lower income areas, high income areas? Is it more prominent in men versus women? There's lots of questions that people study with epidemiology. There's also pharmacology. Pharmacology is the study of the effects of drugs. So we've all taken Tylenol or ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is more for muscles or like body aches types things. Tylenol works well with fevers. That's all been studied on how that stuff works. Or if somebody takes an anxiety drug like Xanax, how does that work in the body? What are the effects of taking that drug? Is there any long-term possible damage from taking some of these drugs? That's all looked at in pharmacology. So any drugs that are out on the market have been through extensive research through pharmacology to find out what they treat, how they treat it, long-term effects. All of that has been looked at. So let's switch gears again. Let's look at basic anatomical terminology. So basic anatomical terminology is terms that we use in the medical field when we're talking about people, patients. So it's terms to know, because depending on what field you want to get into, there are terms that are going to be used throughout the medical community. So it's stuff you need to be able to understand and know. Two of the first words: prone, lying face down. One of the things that helped me distinguish prone versus the next one is supine. Prone has the word on. So if you think of on, you're on your stomach, you're face down. Supine is when the body is laying face up. Supine has the word up in it. So if we think about supine, up, we're laying face up. So if those help remember those two, great. That's what really helped me learn the difference between prone and supine. Is prone says on, so you're on your stomach. Supine has up, you're laying face up. Here's a whole collection of words. Cephalic. That's another name for head. Cranial also means your skull, what protects your brain. Cervical, that's for your neck. Axillary is another word for your armpit. That axillary area is talked about a lot because there's a lot of lymph nodes in that area. So they're axillary lymph nodes, and that's how any nurse or doctor would talk about it. So if you hear the word axillary, you kind of need to know that that's somebody's armpit. Brachial. Brachial is for your arm, but it's only from your shoulder to your elbow. That is considered your brachium. We have antecubital. That is the front part of the elbow. When you had blood drawn, they usually draw blood from your antecubital fossa, is what that's called. That is where the best veins for drawing blood comes from. We have our antebrachial or antebrachium is the other term for your forearm. So that's from your elbow down to your wrist is your antebrachium or antebrachial. Carpal. Carpal is the term for your wrist. There are technically 8 bones that make up your wrist, and those are all your carpal bones. We have our palmar, which is the palm of your hand, digits, or phalanges. Those are the 2 terms that are used for both your fingers and your toes. While we're on your hand, we have your pollex. Your pollex is your thumb. We have frontal, which is your forehead. Frontal is actually the name of the bone that is underneath the skin and the muscle of your forehead. Temporal is where your temples are. Orbital or ocular. for your eyes. Auricle or otic for your ear. Your cheek is buccal. Nasal and oral, those should make sense. Mental is your chin. Sternal, your sternum or your breastbone. We have thoracic, which includes mostly from the end of the cervical technically it should end right about here is your thoracic area. The entire area from the base of your neck all the way down, that is known as your trunk. We have our pelvis or pelvic area. Mammary is for your breast. Umbilical is your navel. Because your navel or your belly button is where your umbilical cord was attached in utero. So that's where the umbilical term actually comes from. Your coxal is your hip bones. The inguinal area, your groin, it's that kind of where that crease in your hips are. Where when you sit, where you have that crease, that's your inguinal area. There is actually an inguinal ligament that goes right through that area. Manual for your hand. That's one that I have not heard used very often. I've heard the rest of them all the time, but manual is one I have not really heard much used for your hand. Pubic is that pubis bone. We have femoral for thigh, because that's where your femur is. Patellar is the front of the knee, because there's the patella there. Some of these names are related to bones in the area. They could be related to muscles in the area. They could be related to, like axillary is related to the lymph nodes in the area. Crural is for leg. So we think femoral is from the hip to the top of the knee. Then we have the patellar surface at the knee. Crural is from below the knee to the ankles. Tarsal is the ankle bones. There's 7 or 8 tarsal bones that make up your foot. They all have special names, just like in your wrist. Those carpal bones all have special names. We have pedal for foot. Dorsum is the top of the foot. Well, plantar is the bottom of the foot, what you stand on. Hallux is the name for your big toe. Just like pollex is the thumb, hallux is your big toe. And on the back side of the body, we have the occipital area. That is also named for a bone in the skull. The occipital bone is the base of your skull. So that area is actually named after the bone there. Scapular. That is also named for the bone, because we have our scapula in this area. So your shoulder blade is the scapula bone, so it's named scapular. Vertebral. That is named for the bones that go all the way down your spinal cord or your spinal column. Each of those bones are vertebral bones or vertebra. The back of your elbow is called the olecranon or olecraconal or cubital. If you remember, the front of that elbow is the antecubital, so the back side is the cubital, back of that elbow. The sacral is the area between the hip bones. There's two separate hip bones, and there's this little triangular bone down at the base of your spinal column. It's called the sacrum. So that's also named after a bone. Gluteal is your buttocks or your butt. That's also named after muscles because you have 3 different gluteal muscles. Perineal is the region of the anus and external genitals. So it's that whole underside is known as the perineal area. Go back and look. We have dorsal. That's the name for the back. Lumbar is again named after the part of the back. There's 5 lumbar vertebrae between those little lines I just drew. If we think the front of your knee is patellar, the back of your knee is popliteal. Sural is calf, while calcaneal is the heel. We have the upper limb, which is your arm, and your lower limbs are your legs. Those are all terms that are good to know, and honestly, the best way to learn some of this stuff like this is flashcards. Just put axial on one side, armpit on the other. Brachial on one side, arm on the other. Antecubital on one side, front of the elbow on the other. These are all terms that you're going to hear a lot in the medical field. So learning them now will save you a lot of trouble later on, and you don't kind of have to feel embarrassed to try to ask somebody what they were talking about. On top of the different parts of the body having different names, there's different directional terms. So each of these directional terms usually refers to something else when you're talking about something, like superior. Superior is towards the head or the upper part of the body. Like my mouth is superior to my chin. So my mouth is above my chin. Inferior, that's another one. It's towards the lower part of the body. Like my foot is inferior to my knee. My knee is higher up, so the foot is inferior or below it. Anterior, towards the front of the body. So we could look, my nose is anterior to my occipital region of the head. Posterior. Posterior is towards the back of the body. Like the popliteal region, the back of the knee, is posterior to the patellar region. So posterior is the back part of the body. So popliteal, back of the knee, is posterior to the patellar, the front of the knee. Medial, which is near midline. My sternum, that breastbone, is medial to my shoulder. There's also lateral, so further from midline. My shoulder is lateral to my sternum. We have intermediate, or between two structures. So my clavicle, those bones, it is medial to your shoulder. It's the top part in the front of it's like your collarbone is what people will call it. Your clavicle is intermediate to my shoulder and my sternum. Ipsilateral is on the same side of the body. So my right shoulder is ipsilateral to my right knee. They're both on the right side of the body. Contralateral is opposite. So my right shoulder is contralateral to my left knee. They're on opposite sides of the body. We have proximal, which is near the attachment of a limb. So your shoulder or your hip is the attachment. So your shoulder is the attachment of your arm, and your hip is the attachment of your leg. So if I say my shoulder is proximal to my elbow, so I'm saying my shoulder is closer to my trunk or my body than my elbow. Distal is further away from. So my fingers are distal to my elbow. My fingers are further away from my trunk or my body than my elbow is. My elbow's closer than my fingers. Superficial is when we're talking about where it's closer to the surface of your body. Like my skin is superficial to my heart. My skin is closer to the outside of the body than my heart is. Or deep is further away from the surface of the body. Like my heart is deep to my sternum because my heart is behind the sternum. That sternum and your rib cage help to protect your heart. So here's some examples. I have charts in here for you that talk about superior. Another word for superior is cranial. So cranial's your head again. Caudal is towards your feet, towards the bottom. Ventral is another term for anterior, while dorsal is another term for posterior. We have medial, lateral, intermediate. These are all terms I just talked about. Proximal, distal, superficial, or sometimes external, and deep or internal. These are all charts for you to help kind of learn some of these because these questions will appear on your test. We also have planes and sections. So there's different ways to divide up the body. We have a sagittal plane or longitudinal plane. That actually divides the body into right and left sides. So that sagittal plane will cut you right down the middle. And you'll have just like you do now, you have everything on the right side of your body and everything on the left side of your body, but it's cut in half. We have a median plane, or it's a midline of the body or organ is divided into equal right or left sides. So we have that, or it's a mid-sagittal plane. We have a paramedian plane or parasagittal plane. It's another word for it. It's where that right or left side divides the body, but it's unequal. So you cut more towards the right side or more towards the left side. We have a coronal plane, which actually divides the body into anterior, front, and posterior or back portions. So again, that coronal plane cuts you into front and back, while sagittal cuts you into right or left. And the other main one is the transverse plane. That cuts you into an upper and a lower portion. So you get the upper portion and the lower portions. and an oblique, which cuts at an angle. So here's the three main ones. We have that sagittal, or as they said, a median plane. We're cutting down the middle, get a right and a left side. We have a coronal, which cuts us in the front and back, and then transverse. Here it's cut right through the stomach. So you have a top half and a lower half for a transverse plane. And here are some different types of imaging for each of those that shows how you can view a sagittal plane, how you can view a coronal plane, and how you view a transverse plane. So when you're dealing with imaging, these are very important to know. And while I'm here, the way this lady is standing is what is called anatomical position. In anatomical position, you're standing with your feet about hip width apart. Your arms are out to the side with your palms of your hands facing forwards. That is considered anatomical position. So when we're talking about medial, distal, when we're talking about right, left, that we're in anatomical position when we're referring to those different terms. So we're standing with our palms facing forwards. So like my thumbs in anatomical position are lateral to my pinky fingers. So wanted to point that one out here. Our body is also split into different cavities. We have a cranial cavity that houses our brain. It also houses most of our special sense organs like sight, hearing, smell, taste. Those are all in your head. It's all in that area. We have our vertebral section, which houses your spinal cord and the beginning of spinal nerves. The nerves that come out of your spinal cord and go to different places around the body. We have our thoracic cavity, our chest cavity. That breaks down even further. We have a pleural cavity, which surrounds the lungs. It's a space around the lungs. We have a pericardial cavity, which is the space around the heart. And we have a mediastinum, which is that central portion of the thoracic cavity. We have an abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be split into an abdominal cavity and a pelvic cavity. So that abdominal cavity has the stomach, spleen, liver, gallbladder, small intestines, and most of the large intestine. While the pelvic cavity has a urinary bladder, portions of the large intestine, internal organs of reproduction. So the uterus, the ovaries, those are internal organs. So here's pictures that show our cranial cavity. It's where our brain is. We have the pleural cavity here for the lungs, the pericardial for the heart, and we have the mediastinum. And what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity is your diaphragm that fits in here. Your diaphragm is what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So here's all your abdominal cavity that contains all of your digestive organs. And then you have your pelvic cavity, which is the internal reproductive organs, the urinary bladder, and your rectum are in that area. So here's another chart for you that talks about the different cavities and what are found in each of those cavities. Now, when you're dealing with stomach, abdominal, pelvic issues, what we tend to do is we split the abdominal pelvic area into different quadrants. There's a 4-quadrant system and a 9-quadrant system. The 4-quadrant system, their names are pretty easy to remember because they are named for exactly where they're at, like right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. So the 4-quadrant system is named for exactly where they're at, while the 9-quadrant system is different. These are named somewhat for the area, but they have more specific names, like right hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, left hypochondriac region, right lateral or lumbar region, left lateral or lumbar region. We have an umbilical region. Then we have a right inguinal region, a left inguinal region, and then a pubic region. Think pubic bone is in the pubic region. We have the inguinal areas where the inguinal area of the body is named for. Hypochondriac, left and right. Epigastric, gastric is for stomach. Umbilical region, so where your belly button is, and then right lateral or lumbar region, and left lateral or lumbar region kind of fits where your lumbar spine is. So 2 more topics, then we're done with our introduction to anatomy. Aging and back to homeostasis. So aging is a very normal process for every single person. And it's a progressive decline in the body's ability to restore homeostasis. So your body can't go back to function like its normal function as easily. Because of this, you're more susceptible to stress and diseases. That's why the older you get, if you've ever noticed, older people tend to get sick more often or have more diseases. That is because their body can no longer maintain that homeostasis. That's what also causes wrinkles, because your skin can't maintain that elasticity. You get gray hair, loss of bone mass, you decrease muscle mass and strength, so as you get older, you're not as strong. A lot of times posture will go as you get older as well. Now let's look at the different kinds of imaging. There's a lot of different kinds of imaging. We're going to look at some of them. There's different techniques for each type of imaging. They help create different views of the body depending on what you want to look at. There's lots of different ways to look at the body through imaging. They help to make a more precise diagnosis, and you can see a big variety of anatomical organs. You can see lots of disorders. Some different kinds of imaging. You can do x-rays, which I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, have had x-rays before. MRIs, CT, a mammogram, that's more for women, but there are men who get it too. Bone density tests, that sometimes gets checked when you get older. Angiogram, that's for the heart. An intravenous urogram, barium contrasts. There's a barium contrast x-ray Let's look at some of those. Here's an x-ray. It's an x-ray of the chest. The darker area here, these are your lungs. Here's your heart. You can actually see on an x-ray if they have an enlarged heart. As the heart is more opaque. It's more shaded in than the lungs. So, and if the lungs are more cloudy, that can signify pneumonia. It can signify other lung conditions. So x-rays are always a really good place to start in dealing with insurance companies. They usually want an x-ray first before you go to more intricate imaging. Mammogram. Here is a mammogram of a female breast. And as you can see, that nice lit up, very bright spot, that is a cancerous tumor in somebody's breast. This is what they see when they do a mammogram, what they are looking at. As we will learn when we get to the skin, some different things to look at when we're identifying cancer. This has a very uneven border. An uneven border is a sign of cancer. A bone density test. This is helping us to look at the density of somebody's bones. Are the bones getting more worn? They're not worn, they're getting demineralized, more calcium, too much calcium is being pulled out of the bones. That'll cause a decrease in bone density. So sometimes this needs to be looked at, especially with older females after menopause, is when most females have problems with bone density. And I'll talk about when we get to the skeleton and the bones, ways to help prevent bone density loss. Angiogram. This is an angiogram of the heart. There's lots of blood vessels on the surface of the heart that help feed the muscle of the heart to keep your heart pumping. If we see this here, there's a block because there's nothing there. There's a block in one of the arteries of the heart. That is showing that that person had a heart attack, which is a blockage of blood flow to the heart somewhere. Here is an intravenous urogram. This person has pretty nice kidney stone in their kidney. That's a pretty big one. That one would be hard to pass, honestly, but there's ways to break those up. But this kind of shows what you can see. They shoot some dye into your veins, and your veins feed into your kidneys. Arteries and veins feed through your kidneys. So it helps to light up. These are all the different parts. Your kidney can kind of see the outline of the kidney here. These are all the different parts within the kidney that we'll learn in anatomy too, but you can see the darkened areas where there's a kidney stone. A barium contrast. This is where somebody swallows barium and then you wait for it to get into the intestines. This is in the colon. This person has cancer in their colon. So we can use imaging. This is an x-ray, just a basic x-ray, and they've got some dye going through their system that helps to light up the intestines, and it helps to show there's something in there that should not be there. Here's an MRI of the brain. It's a sagittal cut, so we've cut it right down the middle, left and right. You see all the different parts of the brain in an MRI. We can see the cerebellum, the whole cerebrum in here. Then you get the midbrain and the pons and this area, all stuff we'll learn when we get to the nervous system. And then the last type of imaging we have here is a CT, or computed tomography. This is of the thorax. This is a cut through the chest. You can see here's your spinal cord, or your spine. There's where your spinal cord sits. Your aorta is the biggest blood vessel that comes off of the heart that helps to feed the rest of the body. Then we have our heart here. This is how all of these are lit up in a CT. Around here, these are your lungs. And all the little white specks in there are blood vessels. The bigger blood vessels in the lungs. And that brings us to the end of chapter 1. If you have any questions, you can feel free to send an email, send a text, reach out, or bring them to lab. Because I can answer any questions when we are in lab as well. Thank you. Bye.